There is a question that most believers never ask, not because they do not care, but because they have taken the answer for granted since the first day they ever held a Bible. The question is this: who decided that these specific books, and not others, would form the most widely read text in the history of humanity? The Bible did not fall from heaven prepackaged and bound with a table of contents. It did not arrive all at once, written by a single hand in a single night of inspiration. What you hold when you open that book is the result of centuries of oral transmission, writing, recognition, debate, preservation, and faith. And the story of how that process actually unfolded is so historically rich and so spiritually charged that understanding it permanently changes the way you read every single page. Today we are going deep into that story, not from the surface, but into the most consequential decisions the community of faith made across the centuries about which text deserved to carry the name Word of God. By the time we are done, you will understand not only how the Bible was formed, but why that formation was not a historical accident at all, but a process that carried a direction from the very beginning. To answer the question of who decided, you first have to understand something that sounds simple but that most people have never seriously considered. The Bible was not assembled all at once. It was recognized gradually, and there is an enormous difference between assembling something and recognizing something. When a mineralogist identifies a diamond among dozens of stones, he is not creating it. He is discovering it. What happened with the books of the Bible is far closer to that process of recognition than to an arbitrary vote in a conference room. If this kind of historical and spiritual deep dive fires something in you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video like this one. Drop a like and share it, because what we are about to explore is the kind of knowledge that transforms the way you read Scripture forever. Let's start at the beginning, with the Old Testament, long before the concept of a canon existed in any form close to what we know today. The people of Israel did not have a bound Bible. They had texts, they had scrolls, they had writings that were read aloud during sacred festivals, in synagogues, in households, where faith was passed from one generation to the next. It is worth pausing on that image. Entire generations of Jewish families who could not read were hearing the sacred texts recited from memory by those who knew them. The transmission was not only literary, but communal, embodied, alive in the daily practice of a people who had built their entire identity around those words. When a text reached the ears of someone hearing it for the first time, it did not arrive as abstract novelty. It arrived as the confirmation of something that had already been living in the community before that individual was born. That rootedness in communal life is one of the most important and least discussed factors in the formation of the canon. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, occupied a position of absolute authority from very early on. Not because a committee had decided so, but because the text itself records Moses' writing and the people pledging obedience to what was written. Deuteronomy 31 describes Moses handing the book of the law to the Levitical priests with explicit instructions to read it before all Israel every 7 years. That text was already being treated as binding, as sacred as the recorded voice of God, long before anyone thought of calling it a canon. The prophets came next. Writings like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets circulated among the people with an authority that was not conferred from above, but recognized from below. The people read them, preserved them, copied them with a level of care that went far beyond ordinary literary interest. The Jewish scribes who copied these texts eventually developed elaborate rituals to ensure not a single error crept in. They counted the letters of every column, every page, every book. If the count did not match, they destroyed the entire copy and started over. That degree of reverence is not reserved for texts that simply seem interesting. It is reserved for texts that a community has recognized as something more than human. The writings, the third block of what the Hebrews called the Tanakh, including the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and others, took longer to fully crystallize their authority. Some of these texts generated debate among the rabbis themselves. The Song of Solomon, for instance, was contested because its language is so ardent, so intensely poetic, and apparently sensual, that some questioned whether it belonged among the sacred texts at all. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most respected figures of his generation, defended it with a line that has stayed in the history of Jewish thought. All the world is not worth the day on which the Song of Solomon was given to Israel. He was not making a literary judgment. He was testifying to what generations of readers had experienced when they encountered those words. That was the nature of canonical recognition, not an institutional decree from the top down, but a testimony rising from the lived experience of a community across time. The process reached a point of formalization around the Council of Jamnia, approximately in the year 90 AD, when Jewish rabbis gathered in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple to codify and preserve their sacred heritage. This council did not invent the Old Testament. What it did was formally declare what Jewish communities had been recognizing and practicing for centuries. The distinction is critical. Formalizing is not creating. It is declaring what already exists. Now we come to the New Testament, and here the story grows even more complex and even more fascinating. The first followers of Jesus did not wake up on the morning of Pentecost with a New Testament under their arms. They woke up with an experience, with memories of words and events they had witnessed, and with an urgency to share everything before time ran out. The earliest records of Jesus' teachings were oral. They were transmitted person to person, community to community, with the precision that ancient oral cultures reserved for the most important texts. In the first century world, oral tradition was not the poor cousin of written transmission. In many cases, it was the primary channel for conveying what a community considered most valuable. Over time, that oral transmission began to be fixed in writing. Paul's letters are probably the earliest New Testament texts we can date with reasonable certainty. 1 Thessalonians was written around 50 AD, barely 2 decades after the crucifixion. Paul was not writing with a Bible in mind. He was writing to answer urgent questions from real communities facing real problems. But what he wrote carried something his recipients recognized immediately as more than personal advice. The churches themselves began sharing these letters with each other. Colossians 4:16 records Paul asking that his letter be read in the church at Laodicea and that the church at Colossae read the letter from Laodicea. A network of shared texts was forming, read publicly, treated with the same reverence that Jewish communities had given to the writings of the prophets. The Gospels represent their own chapter within this story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not 4 competing versions of the same story. They are 4 complementary perspectives that the early church recognized from very early on as indispensable in their totality. The fact that all 4 were preserved, when it would have been entirely possible to simplify and keep just one, says something powerful about how the earliest Christian communities understood the richness of those testimonies. Mark is the most concise, the most urgent, the closest to Peter's oral tradition. Matthew is the most structured, oriented toward Jewish readers, loaded with connections to Old Testament prophecy. Luke is the most narrative, the most carefully researched, written by someone who openly declares having investigated everything thoroughly from the beginning. John is the most theological, the most probing in its exploration of who Jesus is. 4 distinct voices, one testimony recognized as faithful. Now we arrive at the heart of the question. How exactly was it decided whether a text deserved to be included? The answer was neither simple nor arbitrary. The leaders of the early church applied criteria that had developed organically over decades of communal use and discernment. The first and most fundamental was apostolicity. Did the text have a direct connection to the apostles or to their immediate circles of influence? This did not necessarily mean the apostle himself had taken up the pen. Mark was not an apostle, but he wrote under the direct influence of Peter. Luke was not an apostle either, but he was a close companion of Paul and makes the explicit declaration of having investigated everything rigorously. The question was not simply who wrote it, but whether the text could be traced back to the testimony of those who had actually been there. The second criterion was doctrinal coherence. A text that contradicted the central teaching already received, regardless of how ancient or how mystically attractive its claims, was automatically disqualified. This was not intellectual rigidity. It was the protective guardrail of a community that knew texts existed specifically designed to mislead, to introduce ideas that seemed spiritual but corrupted the core of the apostolic message. Paul had warned about this with urgency in Galatians. Even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. Coherence was non-negotiable. The third criterion was universality of use. Texts recognized as authoritative tended to be those already being read, quoted, and applied broadly in communities that were geographically far apart from each other. A text with circulation only in a small group, a particular region, or among a specific theological tendency raised suspicion. The breadth of recognition was itself a signal, not because the majority is always right, but because in this case, the geographic distribution of use indicated that the text had crossed cultural boundaries and continued to be recognized as carrying the same spirit as the undisputed texts. There was also a fourth criterion that historians of the canon mention less frequently, but that is equally significant: transformative capacity. Communities that used these texts consistently in worship, in instructing new believers, and in navigating internal and external crises reported again and again that the canonical texts produced results the other texts did not produce. They converted lives. They unified fragmented communities. They provided clarity in the middle of doctrinal confusion. Eusebius of Caesarea, the first great historian of the church writing in the 4th century, documented meticulously how the churches of his era described the experience of reading the apostolic texts compared to reading texts of more doubtful circulation. The difference in his testimony and in those he cited was not simply one of literary quality, it was a difference in category of spiritual impact. Now we come to the part that generates the most misunderstanding in popular conversation about this topic: the books that were left out. In the ancient world, there were texts that spoke of Jesus, of the apostles, of creation, of the end of time. Some were openly fictional. Others were sincerely religious but carried doctrines that contradicted the core of the apostolic message. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, is a text that has generated enormous fascination in recent centuries. It contains sayings attributed to Jesus, some of which have parallels with the canonical Gospels. But it also includes teachings of a Gnostic character that radically distort the understanding of who Jesus is and what salvation means. It was not excluded by conspiracy. It was excluded because the communities that knew the apostolic message most deeply recognized it as foreign to the testimony they had received. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas. Each of these texts has its own history of circulation and its own reason for exclusion. Some were considered useful as edifying reading, but not as authoritative text. Others presented serious doctrinal problems. None was excluded by an obscure and arbitrary vote of men who wanted to control what others could read. The councils that formalized the New Testament canon, the Council of Hippo in 393 and the Council of Carthage in 397, arrived when the process of recognition had already been underway for centuries. What these councils did was put in writing, with institutional authority, what the practice of the churches had been confirming for generations. There is a letter from Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, written in 367, that lists exactly the 27 books of the New Testament as we know them today. And Athanasius did not present it as a novelty. He presented it as a declaration of what was already recognized in the churches. 3 decades before the councils mentioned above, a bishop of one of the most theologically advanced communities in the ancient world was already describing the canon as something established. There is also an aspect of this story that deserves far more attention than it typically receives: the role of persecution in shaping the canon. During the centuries of Roman persecution, especially under Emperor Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th, imperial authorities demanded that Christians surrender their sacred texts to be destroyed. Those who complied were called traditores, the term from which we derive our word traitor. Faced with that pressure, communities had to make very concrete decisions. Which texts were so indispensable that it was worth risking your life to hide them? Which texts justified the martyrdom of the person who preserved them? That question, answered with blood, in many cases acted as a brutal and clarifying filter. The texts for which people chose to die rather than surrender were the texts that those same people recognized as non-negotiable. Persecution paradoxically sharpened the communal sense of what was truly essential and what was secondary. There is also a dimension that cannot be reduced to historical or institutional criteria, one that the Church Fathers themselves articulated in different but converging ways. The experience that certain texts carried within them something the others did not have. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin in the Vulgate and was one of the most rigorous scholars of early Christianity, described this reality with a powerful image. He said that when he read Paul's letters, he heard thunder in the text. That was not decorative metaphor. It was the description of an experience that readers of Scripture have reproduced across the centuries. The sense that certain texts carry a weight, a resonance, a capacity to transform the reader that cannot be explained purely by literary quality or by the antiquity of the writing. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential theologian of the early centuries, wrote in his Confessions that he had spent years reading the philosophy of Plato and the rhetoric of Cicero with intellectual admiration, but that when he finally picked up Paul's letters with humility, he found something philosophy could not give him, a light that reached the interior and left nothing in its previous place. That recognition, which transcends academic analysis, is an integral part of the canon formation process, not as an irrefutable argument for the skeptic, but as a consistent testimony across centuries and cultures that these texts do something the other texts do not do. There is one final element of this story that deserves all the attention it rarely receives: continuity. The Bible is not simply an ancient book that survived. It is the most copied, most translated, most distributed, and most read text in the entire recorded history of humanity. That is not accidental. In the ancient world, texts that were not considered important simply vanished. The copying process was expensive, laborious, and reserved for what the community considered genuinely valuable. The fact that the books of the canon survived in thousands of manuscripts in languages ranging from Greek to Coptic, from Latin to Syriac, Armenian, and Ethiopic speaks to a preservation that involved entire communities across millennia. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, include fragments of every Old Testament book except one, Esther, and their text aligns with extraordinary fidelity to the Masoretic text that Jewish scribes had preserved centuries later. That consistency between manuscripts separated by hundreds of years and thousands of miles is not the product of editorial conspiracy. It is the result of a community that treated these texts as something that could not be altered because they did not belong to any individual copyist, but to everyone. The understanding that emerges from all of this is that the Bible was formed through history, but its authority does not rest on history alone. It rests on the continued recognition of generations who read these texts and found in them something that the other texts, however ancient or however interesting, did not carry in the same way. The councils did not create that authority. They declared it. The apostles did not manufacture that testimony. They transmitted it, and the millions of people across the centuries who have opened those pages with hunger and found in them what they were looking for have confirmed through their own experience what the earliest communities recognized from the beginning. Understanding how the Bible was formed does not weaken faith. It makes faith more informed, more grounded, more capable of responding honestly to the questions that modern skepticism raises. Because the answer is not that an institution decided it. The answer is that a community recognized it across time, guided by criteria that remain coherent, preserved by people who in many cases paid with their lives for the right to keep reading what you read today with complete freedom. If this video opened something in you that you did not know was closed, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel to keep exploring these kinds of questions together. Share this video with someone who has ever wondered how the Bible was put together or who wants to understand it at a deeper level. And leave a comment. Which part of this process surprised you most? I would love to read your answer.
Et Deus erat verbum,